Hello everyone, welcome to Train Talk. We are coming to the end of the year, and appropriately, the subject of today's episode is the last car on the train. That's right, we will be talking all about the caboose. I'll discuss briefly what a caboose is and historically what purposes the caboose served, followed by a look at the different types of cabooses, and finishing off with some ways that cabooses are still being used today. But before we get any further, what is a caboose? A caboose is a railroad car that at one time was used regularly on the end of freight trains as well as some trains hauling both freight and passengers. Cabooses were used for train crew members to keep an eye out on the rest of the train as it traveled along the railroad. In addition, cabooses served as an office space for the train conductor to handle any necessary paperwork that had to do with the train. They had a simple design, essentially a box on rails with windows on all four sides. On the inside, they were basic, typically featuring beds, restrooms, storage lockers, a desk or two, some seating, and a stove for heating food and keeping warm in the winter. Cabooses also carried many work tools and supplies that might be needed by the crew. In a sense, this car was essentially a cabin on rails. Not surprisingly, it is believed that the word caboose comes from a similarly spelled Dutch word referring to a cabin on a ship. In addition to serving as a crew office, cabooses were also important in that they were the last car on the train. To let crews on other trains know that this was the last car, lamps were hung from stands on the back platform of the caboose. These lights, known as marker lights, gave rise to the phrase, "bringing up the markers." Along with marker lamps, many cabooses were also painted red for greater visibility. Originally, cabooses were made out of modified boxcars, but over time, their design evolved. In the second half of the 1800s, cabooses were modified to include a small compartment with windows on all four sides that was added above the roofline. These cupolas, as they were called, were used by the train crew to look along the entire length of the train in case there was a problem that needed to be addressed, such as an overheated axle bearing called a hot box. The idea of the cupola is believed to have originated from a conductor working on the Chicago and Northwestern Railway in the 1860s who propped up boxes to stand on so he could look out a hole in the roof of a boxcar that was at the end of his train. Cabooses were used on all freight trains in the United States and Canada up until the 1980s. There were many different types of cabooses built over the years. The standard design was simple with flat sides and a cupola that was the same width as the rest of the car and typically offset slightly to one end of the caboose or the other. There were, however, a number of variants from this that we will now review. The most common variant from the standard design of cabooses was known as the wide vision or sometimes extended vision caboose. These cabooses were similar to the basic caboose, but the cupola section was wider than the rest of the car, giving crews a better view down the tracks along the side of the train. Wide vision cabooses were one of the last new designs to be made, and they were popular with railroads all over the United States. Another variant of caboose is the bay window caboose. Rather than having a cupola, bay window cabooses had a widened bay window midsection providing crews a similar improved forward visibility as the wide vision without having to climb up into the cupola. This version of caboose is older than the wide vision by a few decades, believed to have been first constructed sometime in the 1920s. As freight cars grew in size, they became taller than many cabooses of the time, often completely obscuring the cupola. Bay window cabooses quickly became popular with many railroads, particularly in areas where tunnel and bridge height clearances were an issue. A more unusual type of caboose is the transfer caboose. Transfer cabooses were primarily used for short local freight trains or switching movements in railroad yards. Often they were used on transfer job freight trains moving freight cars from the yard of one railroad company to another. This is, in fact, where the transfer caboose got its name. Because of their use on trains that traveled only short distances, they lacked many of the features that could be found in most other cabooses, such as beds, restrooms, and stoves. Instead, they had a simple rectangular box shape with large end platforms for crews to stand on during switching moves. Like bay window cabooses, transfer cabooses first started to appear on America's railroads around the 1930s. The flat roof caboose was among the earliest designs of cabooses. Quite simply, this was a caboose without a cupola. They were often made from modified boxcars or flat cars, but some were also built as cabooses. These eventually gave way to cupola cabooses in the second half of the 19th century. The drover's caboose was another old design. In ways, it was closer to being a passenger car than a caboose. They had the appearance of a combination car with a sliding door for baggage, with the addition of a cupola on the roof. They were often used on livestock trains in the western United States. Finally, we get to the bobber caboose. The major unique feature about the bobber caboose was the single truck with 2 axles for a total of just 4 wheels. Other caboose designs featured 2 trucks, each with 2 axles. The downside to having just 2 axles was a poor ride quality, causing a bobbing motion. This is where the bobber caboose got its name. Bobber cabooses were used by some eastern railroads as well as some mining, logging, and other short line operations. Cabooses were first used sometime in the 1830s or possibly 1840s. As trains began to grow in length and travel greater distances, it became apparent that it was necessary to have a place to station crews on long freight trains to keep an eye out for any problems that might arise during the train's journey. The caboose was the solution, providing the ideal place from which to inspect the train continuously while it was in motion, as well as creating a viewing platform on the end of the train to assist during switching moves. As I previously mentioned, the first cabooses were made from modified freight cars, but eventually they were built as all-new rail cars. In the early days, before trains used air brakes, crews had to walk along the roofs of all the cars, tying down metal brake wheels when the train needed to slow down. These crew members, called brakemen, were typically stationed in the caboose, and when signaled by the locomotive crew, often through the use of whistle signals, would climb up the ladders of the caboose and then walk the length of the train, applying or releasing brakes depending on what was signaled. Another brakeman would walk from the locomotive cab, performing the same task of applying or releasing brakes until meeting the brakeman from the caboose somewhere midway along the train. Eventually, air brakes were designed and implemented on all trains in the United States, but the caboose continued to serve an important role as an office for the train crew. Here, the conductor, the crew member who is in charge of the train and its safe operation over the railroad, would read through and file any important paperwork related to the train, either obtained at the beginning of the work session or picked up at various stations the train would pass through on its journey. And, despite no longer having to walk the length of the train to apply brakes, brakemen continued to play an important role, assisting in switching moves on the ground and throwing any hand-thrown switches as needed. As the railroads transitioned into the 20th century, cabooses changed from a mostly, or in some cases all, wooden construction to an all-steel construction. Steel provided greater durability, protecting the crew and keeping the car in service for a longer time. Over the next several decades, cabooses continued to soldier on. They were a recognizable sight on the end of every freight train that would pass by, but now they seem to have all but vanished into the history books. So what happened? Into the second half of the 1900s, the railroads were looking desperately for cost-cutting measures, facing increased competition from trucks. In attempting to maximize efficiency, cabooses were seen as an unnecessary expense, costing the railroad in construction, maintenance, and switching moves just to put a caboose on the end of each train. The railroads found their escape from the caboose in the form of the end-of-train device, or EOT for short. These are also called FREDs, or flashing rear-end devices. The end-of-train device is quite simply just that, an electronic device that is attached to the rear coupler of the last car on the train and is tied into the train's air brake system. The EOT relays important information to the cab of the leading locomotive, such as brake pressure, as well as speed and direction of the last car. In short, it keeps track of the end of the train. The first end-of-train devices appeared on the Florida East Coast Railroad in 1969. In just 3 years, the FEC had replaced all of their cabooses on mainline freights with end-of-train devices, and by the mid-1980s, cabooses were essentially gone from all mainline freight trains in all of North America. The era of the caboose had come to a close. Today, cabooses continue in service on most major freight railroads, although in much lower numbers. They are used on freight movements where the train backs up frequently or for extended periods of time, such as in yard switching, transfer service, or local freight trains that stop at many different industries along the route to set out and pick up cars. Railroads now often refer to them as shoving platforms, as their new primary function is to serve as a platform for crew members to stand on while the locomotives are shoving the train in reverse. Information regarding any upcoming dangers or stopping distances is relayed from the back platform of the caboose to the engine crew over the radio. Along with their limited use in freight service, cabooses can also be seen on many different tourist railroads and museums, giving rides to the public. While the era of the caboose has come and gone, the surviving examples at museums, on tourist railroads, and in limited freight service serve as a reminder of railroads come and gone. A rich past and very much a different era of work on the railroad. The red caboose on the end of a freight train will forever be an icon of railroading history in North America. Thanks for joining me for this in-depth look at the caboose. If you want to learn even more about cabooses, including some other interesting details that I didn't have time to include in this video, there's an excellent article from Trains magazine that was published in 2006 that greatly helped me with some of the research for this video. I will leave a link in the description if you want to check that out. As always, leave any comments or questions you may have in the comment section below. New videos every Friday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific Time right here on the YouTube channel, and also be sure to check out all of the stuff I post on my other social media accounts. Additionally, if you're not already, you can subscribe to the channel and remember to click the bell button, and hopefully YouTube will alert you whenever I upload a new video or post something on the community tab of the channel page. That's it for now. Until next time, I'm Mike Armstrong. I'll see you down the line. Thanks for watching.